So, you want to be a UFC fighter. Paul Felder versus Dan Hooker. The main fight for UFC Auckland. What an interesting fight. And I want to layer this fight with a theme. And the theme is appreciation. So you say, Kev, that's a really interesting theme that you're talking about in one of fighting. And I say, absolutely, but I think it's warranted and definitely one that really permeated with me while watching this fight and definitely hearing the criticisms and hearing the commentary from people around me in the pub that I was in. So I'm going to put a picture currently now, and this is Dan Hooker and Paul Felder after the fight. They've looked like they've both, run in front of a truck or a car. In no other sport is there such a huge emotional and physical tone than in fighting and in UFC fighting. And boy, do these warriors put themselves out on the line here. So this is not a public service announcement. I definitely don't want it to go down that route. But I think we as consumers, when we watch this, we need to layer it with that level of appreciation. And why am I coming on this sort of tangent when it's basically a fight recap for Paul Felder versus Dan Hooker, in that I can talk about many aspects of this fight. I could say it wasn't the most entertaining fight that I'd seen, especially in the first 3 rounds, which I believe that Dan Hooker won, and it eventually won him the fight, in my opinion. I can talk about how an individual in Dan Hooker had the weight of a nation on him. The card was literally called UFC Auckland. And potentially that weight manifested in a performance that wasn't up to his ability. Both of these fighters came in with very impressive resumes. Both fighting in the stacked lightweight division, which basically is the worst division to be in if you have ambitions to harbor a title. Khabib is a champion. Tony Ferguson is in that. Conor McGregor is lurking around. Don't even bother. Don't bother. So quality opponents, a really quality match. Dan Hooker from New Zealand really gathering some strong momentum, beating Al Iaquinta in his last fight, and really gathering some strong momentum coming up there. Paul Felder, always a strong name, always a strong performance. His last performance, a very impressive split, a tight decision, but a very impressive win over Edson Barboza. So both fighters fighting in a stacked division with really respectable records, with strong momentum, coming up to what was a fight that was going to catapult whoever the winner was into the upper echelon of the conversation, probably the top 7 ranking. So enormous expectations in that particular right. So throw in the fact that it's in Auckland, it's in New Zealand, and Dan Hooker is heading the card, and this is the first time that potentially both fighters are fighting in a 5-round fight. Different dynamic altogether. So here's the thing. Dan Hooker comes in with a very sort of impressive resume, with a name such as Hangman Hooker. He obviously has submission skills. But in his last couple of fights, he really found a way to integrate his stature in fighting on the outer, using his reach to really pick apart. And in no other fight was this really apparent than in the Iaquinta fight. So really coming in his own in the striking department and coming in as bets on favorite purely because he had that physical advantage. Paul Felder is a no-nonsense fighter, likes to get in your face, fight in the pocket. And, that fight against Edson Barboza was razor thin. The decision was razor thin. And he came out there, but he took a lot of damage. And he's a fighter that doesn't shy fighting in the pocket, dishing damage and taking damage to do so. So really sort of interesting fight and really a litmus test for Dan Hooker and Paul Felder in that particular regard. So look, the first 3 rounds was nothing to write home about. We see Hooker using his natural gifts in terms of the range and striking apart and really picking apart Felder with his jab. And I think a lot of people, round 1 was a feeling out round. It was a feeling out round. And round 2 and 3, you saw what was a really tame level of output by Hooker. I'm not too sure what was going in his mind. He was definitely touching up Felder, and it was definitely reflective on Felder's face. In fact, I believe beginning the second round, Felder had already had uh, a welt, or there was definitely something happening in his eye, and that basically plagued him throughout the fight. Um, Interestingly enough, you see Felder coming in with his usual aggression, and he throws what patented is a strong word, but he uses the spinning back fist a fair amount of times, and he completely loses balance. And why I thought this was really an interesting thing to observe is he came out very wild, but it seemingly was, it wasn't that controlled wildness, if that kind of even makes sense, from Paul Felder. It seemed like after that strike, and potentially it wasn't that strike that led to that, there was a bit of shyness to engage in that particular regard. So he really walked into a lot of the rangy attacks that Hooker had. And interestingly enough, the best execution in terms of an example fight that Hooker had in terms of fighting in that particular regard was against Al La Quinta, where he was sharp, man. He was going often and early, much like Tyson Fury did to Deontay Wilder with that jab. And while he was reaching there, he was, planting those levels of damage to Felder. It wasn't with any regular cadence, and it really felt like there was a shyness and lack of output. And this is where I bring in the fact that pressure does a lot of things to different people. Now, I can only speak to what I saw, and obviously I don't fight. And now, again, back to appreciation. There is a level of appreciation of what these fighters do, and you got to understand that pressure does a lot of things for different people. And when you're fighting freely, you often fight at your best when your instincts run how you govern your actions and how you govern, those angles, and how you slip and rip and how you kind of let go. It felt that there was this tension in Dan Hooker, and it really permeated in the way that he fought. It almost felt that he was fighting towards a point fighting mentality, and fighting not necessarily to win, but not to lose. So you could say cruisingly in the first 3 rounds, he adopted this manner, and it was working. And that's the thing. If that sort of fighting style works, can you really blame a guy from not administering that across the board? And again, back to appreciation. I guess what I heard from the individuals around me was that it was a pretty boring sort of fight. And I have to agree, from an aesthetic perspective, that was definitely the case. But these guys were putting it out there. Look, in round coming into round 3, sorry, I guess another aspect here that really needs to be considered is for both fighters that this was the first time that they'd potentially had exposure to a 5-round fight. Now, there's a lot of difference that extra 10 minutes adds, and especially for an explosive fighter such as Paul Felder, who loves going into the pocket and who is basically rationalized as a fighting strategy that he needs to take some to give some. It potentially weighed in the fact that he was relatively trigger shy in that particular regard, in getting in his face. And it felt like the 3rd round was when he threw that shyness out, and he really went after Hooker, getting into the pocket, landing often and early. And it is really here where we start seeing a sizable advantage flip in terms of what was, momentum for the fight. Here is where we saw, the Paul Felder really come up against the cage, do a little bit of dirty boxing, throw his weight against Hooker, and really land a lot of punches. And this manifested itself in the 4th and in the 5th round. We saw some really entertaining swings and engagement. And towards the back end of the 5th round, there was a scramble over there, and Dan Hooker took Felder down. Felder came out swinging, and the fight lasted to the end. And interestingly enough, I always thought, especially once it went to the judges, that it was always going to be a win for Hooker, because I thought the first 3 rounds it was clearly Hooker's. Close, but clearly Hooker's. Dan Hooker, that is. Interestingly enough, upon the interview, we see a really, despondent Paul Felder, potentially hinting that this was his last fight. I really hope that sincerely that that's not the case. He's got a great record, and he's a good fighter. It's an emotional time, and Felder definitely seems like a guy that wears his heart on his sleeve, especially in the way he fights and the things he says. So there's definitely a part of him that didn't feel that way, but for our sakes, he's an entertaining fighter. He's an articulate individual, and he definitely has a career outside of it. So we definitely hope that's not the case. As for Hooker, what do we say here? Look, he's on the right trajectory. Paul Felder, no matter how you win that fight, that was an impressive fight. Could he have been a bit better? Absolutely. I think that the pressure kind of got to him, and he fought in a cadence and mentality that is unconducive to an entertaining fight. But more importantly, there definitely is, especially once you start going up the ranks, a balance that you need to withhold when it comes to fighting an entertaining fight, and especially when it comes to fighting a fight of winning. And I think that's a balance that you see the likes of John Jones currently navigating at the moment, and you can't criticize a guy for that. If you can take away winning fights that's potentially aesthetically displeasing to the audience, but guarantees that you take less damage and you go through, why wouldn't you do that? You'd be silly not to do that. So really moving forward, I believe that Dan Hooker has called out Justin Gaethje. Wow, that'd be a cracker of a fight, and it would really be the next level of litmus test to really see if Hooker is the goods in what is a stacked UFC lightweight division. Personally, I'm not too sure if he's up there, especially off the back of this performance. But for a guy that keeps on winning, you can't. His knocks will be heard by the UFC brass, and good on him. It's great to have the Kiwis and the Australians really represented in that upper echelon in the UFC division. So, look, that's my synopsis of the fight. Comment, guys, below in terms of what you think. Excited. This is an amazing month of fights, and I think we have another fight card, UFC Norfolk, with Benavidez, and I can't remember this other individual's name, but a lot of fights to preview, and I hope to hear from you soon.